February 1941. The border between Hungary and Poland should not exist at night, yet here it was, a line drawn by men with guns, patrolled by soldiers who shot first and never asked questions. On the Hungarian side, in a safe house that smelled of damp wool and fear, a woman prepared to cross. She carried no weapon, no cyanide pill, just a British passport under a name that was not her own, and a smile that had already saved her life 3 times. Her real name was Krystyna Skarbek. The British would call her Christine Granville. History would almost forget her entirely. But on this frozen night, as she prepared to walk into occupied Poland knowing she might never return, she represented something the Nazis had tried to extinguish: the refusal to surrender, even when surrender was the only rational choice. She was 32 years old. She had been a spy for barely a year, and she was about to become one of the most effective intelligence agents of the Second World War, not because she was trained for it, but because she understood something her masters in London did not. War is not won by men in rooms drawing lines on maps. It is won by individuals willing to cross those lines in the dark, alone, and bet their lives that courage weighs more than bullets. The war had not begun for Krystyna Skarbek in September 1939, when German tanks rolled into Warsaw. It had begun years earlier in the slow unraveling of the world she knew. Born in 1908 to Polish aristocracy, she had grown up in a vanishing empire of manors and horses, of French tutors and summer estates. Her father, a count, had lost the family fortune in bad investments. Her mother, a Jewish banking heiress, had given her beauty, languages, and a reckless confidence that made men uneasy. By the time Krystyna reached adulthood, she was stunning, penniless, and allergic to convention. She married young, divorced, then married again, this time to a writer named Jerzy Gajitki, a man as restless and broke as she was. They spent the 1930s drifting across Europe, skiing in the Alps, driving fast cars they could not afford, living on charm and the fading credit of noble names. When Hitler invaded Poland, they were in Kenya on holiday. The news reached them by telegram. Their country no longer existed. Most aristocrats in exile waited. They formed committees, wrote letters, attended fundraisers for the Free Polish Forces. Krystyna Skarbek was not built for waiting. She traveled to London, walked into the War Office without an appointment, and offered herself as a spy. She had no training, no connections, no leverage. But she had something British intelligence desperately needed in late 1939: recent knowledge of Central Europe, fluency in 5 languages, and the kind of fearless poise that could talk its way past a checkpoint or out of a Gestapo cell. The men in the room looked at her with skepticism. Women did not do this kind of work. Not yet, not officially. But the Special Operations Executive, Churchill's new clandestine warfare unit, was just forming. They needed anyone willing to go where the regular army could not. So they gave her a code name, a cover story, and a one-way ticket to Budapest. Her mission was vague, almost suicidal. Get into Poland, gather intelligence, make contact with resistance networks, and get out alive. No one expected her to succeed. Some doubted she would survive the month. She arrived in Hungary in December 1939, just as winter locked the Carpathian Mountains in ice. Budapest was still neutral, a glittering, paranoid city full of refugees, informants, and diplomats pretending not to notice each other. Krystyna moved through it like a ghost. She rented a small apartment, made contact with Polish émigrés, and began planning her first infiltration. The route into Poland was treacherous. Across the Tatra Mountains on foot, through snowdrifts that could swallow a person whole, past German and Slovak patrols that shot smugglers on sight. Local guides refused to take her. It was madness, they said. A woman, alone, in winter. She would freeze or be captured within hours. Krystyna found a different guide, a young Polish ski instructor who knew the mountains intimately. She did not tell him she was a spy. She told him she needed to reach her family. It was not entirely a lie. What she did not say was that she carried microfilm sewn into the lining of her gloves, and that if she were caught, it would mean torture, execution, and the collapse of an intelligence network that was still being born. They crossed on foot in the dead of night, moving through snow so deep it muffled every sound. The cold was absolute. Breath froze in the lungs. The darkness was broken only by starlight on ice. Somewhere below, in the valleys, German soldiers warmed themselves by fires and sang songs from home. Above, Krystyna climbed in silence, her legs burning, her hands numb, her mind fixed on a single thought: keep moving. The border was invisible, unmarked, a fiction that existed only in the minds of conquerors. But crossing it meant everything. On one side, she was a tourist. On the other, she was a spy in enemy territory subject to summary execution. She crossed just before dawn, and for a moment, standing on Polish soil for the first time since the invasion, she allowed herself to feel it. Not triumph, but grief. This was her country, and it was gone. The intelligence work began immediately. Moving under cover of darkness, Krystyna made contact with remnants of the Polish underground, officers, couriers, teachers, and priests who had refused to flee. They met in basements, in churches, in the back rooms of farmhouses. She listened, took notes, memorized names and locations. The Gestapo was everywhere, but so was resistance. Weapons were being hidden, escape routes established, lists compiled of collaborators and Nazis. Krystyna absorbed it all, committing details to memory because writing anything down was too dangerous. She also began recruiting, persuading young Poles to risk their lives carrying messages, hiding Allied airmen, sabotaging rail lines. Her weapon was not a gun. It was belief. She made people believe that their country still existed, that their actions mattered, that someone in London was listening, and they believed her, because she had crossed a frozen mountain to tell them so. But the Gestapo was listening too. By early 1940, rumors of a mysterious woman traveling between Budapest and Poland had reached German intelligence. Descriptions were vague. Beautiful, well-dressed, fluent in German, possibly Hungarian or Polish. She used multiple names, multiple passports. She was seen in cafes, at train stations, always alone, always composed. The Germans began watching the mountain passes. They questioned guides. They increased patrols. Krystyna's window of safety was closing. On her third crossing back into Hungary, she was stopped at a checkpoint by Slovak border guards working under German orders. They searched her belongings, found nothing, but they were suspicious. A woman traveling alone at night with no luggage, no clear destination. It did not add up. They took her to a small room and told her to wait. Through the thin walls, she could hear them telephoning someone. She knew what came next. The Gestapo would arrive. They would question her properly, and she would either talk or die. What happened in that room became legend. Krystyna did not panic. She did not try to run. She bit down on her own tongue until it bled, then let the blood pool in her mouth. When the guards returned, she coughed violently, spattering blood onto her hands, her clothes, the table. She gasped that she was dying, that she had tuberculosis, that she had been traveling to see a doctor in Budapest. The guards recoiled. Tuberculosis was a death sentence, and it was contagious. They wanted nothing to do with her. They let her go, shoving her toward the Hungarian side of the border, terrified she would infect them. Krystyna walked out into the night, wiped the blood from her lips, and disappeared into the darkness. The Gestapo arrived 20 minutes later. By then, she was gone. She returned to Budapest, filed her report with British intelligence, and prepared for the next mission. But something had shifted. The war was no longer an abstraction, a distant tragedy happening to other people. It was a mechanism designed to crush the individual, to reduce human beings to numbers, to erase stories like hers before they could be told. And yet she had survived. Not through luck, but through will. She had looked at the machinery of the Third Reich and found its weakness. It could not account for someone who refused to be afraid. That refusal would define the rest of her war. It would take her into France, into the Alps, into rooms where men held her life in their hands, and she smiled until they let her go. But it would also take her, eventually, to a small hotel room in London, where the war would find her one last time, not as a hero, but as a ghost the world no longer needed. The snow over the Carpathians was falling again. Somewhere in the passes, another courier was preparing to cross. Another message was being carried. Another life was being risked for a country that existed now only in memory. Krystyna Skarbek had proven it could be done, but the cost of that proof was still being calculated. And the question no one in London dared to ask was this: how many crossings could one woman survive before the mountain claimed her? The answer was waiting in the darkness, and it was patient. By spring 1941, Krystyna Skarbek had crossed the Carpathian Mountains 6 times. Each crossing left marks, frostbite scars on her fingers, a persistent cough that never quite disappeared, and something harder to measure: the weight of carrying other people's hopes across borders drawn in blood. Budapest had become her operations base, a city suspended between neutrality and complicity, where German officers drank in the same cafes as British spies and everyone pretended not to notice. She lived in a modest apartment on the Buda side, near the river, in a building filled with refugees who asked no questions because they did not want to answer any themselves. Her cover was thin: a Polish aristocrat waiting out the war, living on money wired from relatives abroad. It was just plausible enough to survive casual scrutiny, but the Gestapo was not casual anymore. They were hunting. Her partner in these operations was a man named Andrzej Kowerski, a former Polish cavalry officer who had lost part of his leg in the 1939 invasion and replaced it with a wooden prosthetic that clicked faintly when he walked. The British called him Andrew Kennedy. He was stocky, sardonic, and utterly fearless in the way of men who had already died once and found the experience overrated. He had met Krystyna in Budapest through the tangled network of Polish exiles, and within weeks they were inseparable. Professionally first, then personally. They were not lovers yet, though that would come. What they shared in those early months was something rarer: absolute trust. In their line of work, trust was the only currency that mattered. A blown cover, a careless word, a moment of doubt at a checkpoint, any of these could mean death. Kowerski never doubted her. And Krystyna, who had spent her life surrounded by men who underestimated her, never forgot it. Together, they built something remarkable. Using Krystyna's contacts inside occupied Poland and Kowerski's logistical cunning, they established a courier network that stretched from Warsaw to Budapest to London. Messages were carried by ski instructors, priests, shopkeepers, and university students. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things because someone had convinced them it was possible. Krystyna was the architect of that conviction. She moved through occupied Europe with a kind of magnetic certainty, persuading people to risk everything for a cause that seemed, on most days, utterly lost. She carried no weapon, relied on no threats. Her tools were charm, languages, and an instinct for reading people that bordered on clairvoyance. She knew when to flirt, when to appeal to honor, when to simply sit in silence and let a person talk themselves into courage. British intelligence later estimated that her network produced some of the earliest and most accurate reports on German troop movements, fortifications, and morale in Eastern Europe. But the reports never captured what mattered most: the human cost of gathering them. One mission in particular revealed the stakes. In March 1941, Krystyna was tasked with extracting 2 Polish intelligence officers from occupied Czechoslovakia. They were hiding in a safe house outside Prague, waiting for evacuation, but the Gestapo was closing in. The only route out was through the mountains into Hungary, the same route Krystyna had used, but now heavily patrolled. She and Kowerski drove as close as they dared, then hiked the final stretch on foot through snowdrifts that came up to their waists. They found the officers half-starved, exhausted, and convinced they were going to die. Krystyna told them they were leaving that night. The men protested. It was suicide. The passes were watched. They would be caught within hours. She looked at them with those dark, unwavering eyes and said something that one of the officers would remember for the rest of his life. She said, "The Germans expect us to be afraid. So we will not be." They crossed that night, moving in single file through darkness so complete it felt like drowning. Twice they heard patrols below them, voices carried on the wind, the snap of boots on frozen ground. Each time, Krystyna signaled for silence and they waited, barely breathing, until the danger passed. They reached Hungary just before dawn. The officers went on to Britain and rejoined the fight. Krystyna returned to Budapest and prepared for the next mission, but the net was tightening. By mid-1941, the Gestapo had compiled a file on her. Not a name yet, but a pattern. A woman, multiple border crossings suspected of espionage. Informants in Budapest were being pressured. Safe houses were being raided. One of Krystyna's couriers was arrested and interrogated. He said nothing, but the Gestapo did not need him to talk. They needed only to watch and wait. In January 1942, Krystyna and Kowerski were both arrested by Hungarian police acting on German orders. They were taken to separate cells in a Budapest prison, stripped of their belongings and told they would be handed over to the Gestapo within 48 hours. For most spies, this was the end. The Gestapo did not negotiate. They did not make mistakes. Once in their hands, survival was measured in hours, and death, when it came, was often a mercy. Krystyna had no illusions about what awaited her. She had seen the aftermath. Bodies dumped in rivers, names carved into cell walls, the hollow eyes of those who had been broken. She knew that courage had limits, that everyone talked eventually, that the only question was how much damage you caused before you did. She also knew she was not going to let it happen. From her cell, she began to orchestrate one of the most audacious bluffs of the war. She convinced a sympathetic guard to carry a message to the British legation in Budapest. The message was simple. Christine Granville and Andrew Kennedy, British agents arrested and awaiting transfer to Gestapo custody. Request immediate intervention. The British, to their credit, acted fast. They contacted a Hungarian officer they had been bribing for months, a man whose loyalty could be purchased but who was terrified of backing the wrong side. The offer was straightforward. Release the prisoners, and when the war ends, because it will end and Germany will lose, you will be remembered as someone who helped the Allies. Refuse, and you will be remembered differently. The officer hesitated. Helping British spies was treason, punishable by death if the Germans found out. But the tide of the war was shifting. Stalingrad was bleeding the Wehrmacht dry. The Americans were in the fight now. And this woman, this Christine Granville, had a reputation. Even in captivity, she radiated a strange, unshakable confidence that made men believe her when she said the Germans would lose. The officer made his decision. On the morning they were supposed to be transferred, Krystyna and Kowerski were instead escorted quietly out of the prison and driven to the Yugoslav border. They were told never to return to Hungary. They crossed into Yugoslavia on foot, exhausted, filthy, and free. Krystyna later said she never learned the name of the officer who saved them. She did not need to. What mattered was that he had chosen to believe in a future beyond the Third Reich. That belief, fragile and desperate as it was, had kept them alive. It was the same belief Krystyna had been planting across occupied Europe for 2 years. The idea that the war was not over, that resistance still mattered, that individual acts of courage could tip the balance. The Gestapo file on her was updated, escaped custody, whereabouts unknown. The hunt continued. But now they had a name, Christine Granville, and they wanted her badly. From Yugoslavia, Krystyna and Kowerski made their way to Cairo, the sprawling, chaotic headquarters of British operations in the Mediterranean. After the frozen mountains of Eastern Europe, Cairo was a shock. Heat, dust, bureaucracy, and a sprawling intelligence apparatus that seemed more interested in filing reports than fighting the war. Krystyna chafed under the inactivity. She had spent 2 years in constant motion, living on adrenaline and instinct, and now she was expected to sit in meetings and debrief analysts who had never seen combat. The British, for their part, did not quite know what to do with her. She was too valuable to waste, too unpredictable to control, and too famous, in the quiet, shadowy way of spies, to deploy without risk. For months, she languished in administrative limbo, assigned to minor courier work and training exercises while the war raged on without her. It was, in some ways, harder than the missions. At least in occupied Poland, the danger had been clear. Here, the enemy was boredom, irrelevance, the creeping fear that the war would end and she would have been forgotten. Then, in early 1944, everything changed. The Allies were preparing for the invasion of France, and the Special Operations Executive needed experienced agents to support resistance networks in the South. Krystyna's knowledge of mountains, languages, and sabotage made her an ideal candidate. But there was a problem. The French networks were dominated by men who did not take orders from women, especially foreign women. The British briefed her carefully. She would be dropped into the Alps, expected to coordinate with the Maquis, to organize sabotage, to prepare for the Allied advance from the Mediterranean. It would be dangerous, they said. More dangerous than Poland. She smiled at that. Nothing, she told them, would ever be more dangerous than walking across the Carpathians in winter, alone, with the Gestapo at her back. They did not argue. They gave her a code name, Pauline, and a parachute, and in July 1944 they flew her into the darkness over occupied France. She landed in the mountains near the Italian border, in a region of alpine forests and narrow valleys where the Maquis had been fighting a lonely, brutal guerrilla war against German occupation forces. The reception committee was wary. They had been promised an experienced British agent. What they got was a woman in her mid-30s, small, elegant, speaking French with a Polish accent, carrying nothing but a pistol and a radio set. The Maquis commander, a gruff former schoolteacher named Francis Camaillertz, met her with barely concealed skepticism. He asked what experience she had. Krystyna did not tell him about the mountains, the arrests, the escapes. She simply said, "Enough." Then she asked what needed to be done. Within a week, Camaillertz was calling her the bravest person he had ever met. Within a month, she had become indispensable. The work in France was different from Poland. Less about gathering intelligence, more about direct action. Krystyna organized supply drops, trained resistance fighters, and led sabotage missions against railways and bridges. She moved through the mountains like a phantom, appearing in villages just long enough to deliver weapons or messages, then vanishing before the Germans could respond. The Maquis fighters, hardened men who had spent years in the wilderness, watched her with something close to awe. She never flinched, never complained, never asked anyone to take a risk she would not take herself. On one mission, she cycled 70 kilometers through German checkpoints to deliver a message, bluffing her way past sentries with a forged pass and a story about visiting her sick mother. On another, she walked into a Gestapo office to negotiate the release of captured resistance fighters, relying on nothing but nerve and the chaos of the collapsing German occupation. The Gestapo officer, exhausted and demoralized, let them go. He did not know who she was. If he had, she would never have left the building alive. But the war was ending, and with it, the brief window in which women like Krystyna could operate outside the normal rules. The Allies were advancing. The Germans were retreating. The world Krystyna had known, where borders were crossed in darkness and survival depended on courage, was disappearing. Soon there would be victory parades, medals, official histories. And in those histories there would be very little room for a Polish countess who had become a British spy, who had saved lives no one would count, who had fought a war that would be remembered in monuments to men. She had crossed the mountains again. But this time, what waited on the other side was not freedom. It was the future. And the future, she was beginning to understand, had no place for her. The Alps were silent now, the gunfire fading into memory. In the valleys below, the Maquis were preparing to celebrate. But Krystyna stood alone on a ridge, looking out over the mountains, and felt something she had not felt in 5 years of war. She felt afraid, not of the Germans, not of capture or death, but of peace. What do you do when the war ends and you have become the war? The question hung in the cold mountain air, unanswered. Below, in the liberated villages, they were singing, but the song had not reached her yet, and she wondered, as the last light faded from the sky, if it ever would.